Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So for this video, I want to talk about Dahmer. That's a series on Netflix. It's about the life of that monster, Jeffrey Dahmer, a serial killer who killed many people. Many of his victims were black men. This man is a horrible person. This man committed all kinds of atrocities against people. He killed people, he dismembered them, he actually ate them. This man was a cannibal, this man was a monster, this man was the worst of humanity. He was a actual devil. That's what this man was. And so you have this series on Netflix, this like a docudrama about his life. And one of my first questions is Netflix giving money to the families of the victims? Because if they're not, it is sick that they would actually profit off of the suffering of these families and not compensate these families. All of the proceeds from Netflix series Dahmer should go to the families of the victims. Because otherwise they are profiting at the expense of these families. They are entertaining people by showing these horrific, grotesque scenes of violence against these actual people. This is not, Friday the 13th. This is not Halloween. This is not some make-believe horror story. This is a real-life horror story with real-life victims. And those victims should be compensated by Netflix. So, yes, so I understand why many people would boycott this particular series. I feel them on that. I understand their position because, this is one of the most disturbing things that I have ever seen on television. It is one of the most grotesque things that I have seen on television. And it's about real people. So I understand why people are boycotting this series, and I fully support you in your boycott. So there are a couple of things that I want to talk about with respect to this series. The first and most blatant and obvious thing is the complete disregard of Black lives. You had police who had time and time again had an opportunity to stop this monster from killing Black people and other people. But because they didn't value Black voices, because they did not value Black lives, this man was given opportunity after opportunity to kill more people. You had a situation where a man escaped from Jeffrey Dahmer. One of his early victims escaped from Jeffrey Dahmer, went to the police about the situation, and the police didn't take his story seriously at all. They eventually went out to investigate, and they basically took the word of a convicted white man, a white man who had been convicted of a crime before. They took his word over a Black man's word, and they basically let Jeffrey Dahmer go. You had a situation where a neighbor was calling the police repeatedly, a Black woman calling the police over and over again because she heard screams from his apartment. She could smell a horrific odor coming from his apartment. And there had been a situation where a young Asian, I think he was an Asian or Hispanic victim, fled Jeffrey Dahmer's home with no clothes on. And this woman and her family reported the situation to the police, and the police allowed Jeffrey Dahmer to continue to torture this person. This young person who was like 14 years old, basically was drugged by Jeffrey Dahmer and lobotomized by Jeffrey Dahmer. And so when the young person tried to escape, he was stumbling around, he was incoherent, he couldn't talk and all that kind of stuff because he had been lobotomized. And the police allowed him to return to Jeffrey Dahmer. And that young person ended up being one of Jeffrey Dahmer's many victims. And then you had a situation where you had the person who finally escaped from Jeffrey Dahmer, one of his very last victims, who escaped from Jeffrey Dahmer. he went to the police, and at first the police weren't believing him and all that kind of stuff because, again, he was a black man. And eventually the police went there and they did discover the atrocities that had been committed. So that's an example of, black lives being completely devalued because these police didn't view black voices as credible, but yet you had this monster who committed these crimes and the police believed his word over their word. The other issue is white privilege. This story is a textbook example of white privilege because here you have a man who flunked out of college, who got kicked out of the armed forces, who was repeatedly fired, but yet he was given opportunity after opportunity to live a productive life. This man had been convicted. And when he was convicted early on for another crime, the judge basically gave him a slap on the wrist. Again, because that judge identified with him and saw him as a fellow white person that deserved a second chance. And I doubt that that very same judge would have been as lenient if Jeffrey Dahmer was black. And then you had situations where the police encountered Jeffrey Dahmer on a couple of occasions and they gave him the benefit of the doubt because of the color of his skin. There's one occasion where he's driving drunk, swerving in the road, and he has trash bags with human remains in them, and the police let him go with a warning. They came to his house, and he tells them some story about, and again, with that situation involving the kid that was lobotomized. Jeffrey Dahmer tells the police that the kid is his boyfriend and that the kid is 19 years old. And because of his white skin, the police automatically believe him. And they, allow this monster to continue to hold this young kid hostage. So there are example after examples of this. The example of that black guy, that one of his earlier victims who reported the crime, the police go to Jeffrey Dahmer's house and the police automatically believe his word. So that's crazy. So there are a couple of other things that I want to talk about with respect to this whole thing. One of the things that comes up is like, I'm on TikTok. And if you're on TikTok, I want to encourage you to follow me on TikTok at New Possibility Blog. But on TikTok, I've been seeing a lot of videos over there about Jeffrey Dahmer. And we know that TikTok is a place where people like to joke around, but people are being absolutely ridiculous on TikTok. You got people reenacting scenes from Jeffrey Dahmer and joking about it. A lot of these people that are reenacting these scenes are black people. And I find that to be sickening. I find it to be repulsive. And I find that, it just shows us how lost this generation is. Here you had a man who targeted black people. And before I go any further, yes, he did have other victims. Some of his victims were white. Some of his victims were Asian. Some of his victims were Hispanic or whatever. But the majority of his victims were black. At one point, he lived in a black neighborhood and he targeted black people. So let's not call this what it is. This man targeted black people, but yet and still you have black buffoons on TikTok joking about this, reenacting certain scenes from this. This man killed black people. This man drugged black people, killed black people, dismembered black people, and actually ate black people. Completely disregarded black lives, but yet and still you had these ignorant buffoons on TikTok joking about this. And it just shows you how callous our society is. It shows you how disrespectful people are. And it shows you, frankly, how sick people are. And it's really sad to see that kind of thing. So there are a couple of other points that I want to talk about with respect to Jeffrey Dahmer's, this particular series. I mentioned like the racial dimensions to this particular story and how sad it was that, this man was able to get away with murder because the police didn't really take black people seriously, didn't take the voices of black people seriously, and automatically gave credit to this white man. So one of the things about this particular series is they showed Jesse Jackson come to the community to raise these particular issues. But here's what I have to say about that. First of all, the character that they used to play Jesse Jackson, the person that played that role didn't do a very good job. And actually, they helped feed the narrative of people like Jesse Jackson being like people that exploit situations for their own personal gain. So I didn't like that aspect of it. And that just made me think about how communities need to, and first of all, I don't have any problem with people from other areas coming into communities to rally around very important issues. That has been the history of the civil rights movement. That was the history of Martin Luther King and others. They would come to communities to address issues within those communities. So I don't have any issue with that. But I think that communities need to be about building their own on-the-ground leadership that can speak to these issues so they don't have a need for any outsiders to come and bring attention to these issues. So that's one thing. And I don't like the way they depict Jesse Jackson in this particular series. They made him seem like he was somebody there to exploit a situation. They made him to be like a cartoon character of himself. So I didn't like that aspect of this particular series. Another thing that comes up is, this whole issue of the church and the concept of forgiveness. Jeffrey Dahmer was watching TV and he saw this story about another serial killer who had became a Christian. And because of that, this person was of the opinion that he would be forgiven for all these crimes he committed. So Jeffrey Dahmer decided to be baptized and be born again and all that kind of stuff. And, these priests and stuff like that talk about how, if somebody is baptized, they're forgiven for all their sins. And they were basically saying that even a monster like Jeffrey Dahmer, a monster who killed many people, who tortured many people, who dismembered people and actually ate people, they were basically saying that this monster, this beast, this damn devil would be forgiven for all his sins. And I think that that is outrageous. I think that that is crazy. I think that God is a God of justice. God is merciful, but God is a just God. And, God does render justice. And, I think that it is outrageous that this man would be able to kill all those people and be forgiven for that. I don't, that doesn't sound like that doesn't make any kind of sense to me. And I doubt that a just and merciful God would actually allow a monster like that to get away with those kind of atrocities. And I think that that is a perversion of religion to say that some monster like this would be forgiven for his sins. And not only did this beast kill people, this beast actually, was reading satanic materials. This beast was actually embracing Satanism. In the story, they talk about how he built an altar to Satan. In the docuseries, they show it. They show that he had the satanic Bible and all that kind of stuff. But yet and still, these quote unquote priests expect people to believe that this monster, this beast, will be forgiven for his sins because he took a bath in some water and because some people that call themselves priests had him recite a few words or say a few words over him. That is absurd. That is a perversion of religion and is outright sickening. And it tells you how lost, some of these quote unquote religious people actually are. The other thing is this whole thing makes me think about the whole issue of the death penalty. And I can't remember if they don't, I think they didn't have the death penalty there. Um, yeah, I don't think they had the death penalty in Wisconsin, but it was an issue that came up because another serial killer was sentenced to death. And it just made me think about the whole issue of the death penalty and whether or not that's something that I support. You know, I understand the arguments against the death penalty because of the racial disparities in death penalties and because of situations where you had innocent people exonerated and all that kind of stuff. I get that. So it's an issue that I struggle with because when I see a monster like this, you know, I don't think a life sentence is any kind of justice really. And really it's hard to find justice in this situation regardless of what kind of sentence this man receives. But I think that if there is a call for a death penalty, it needs to be in a case like this, where this man killed all these people. This man didn't deserve to live. And frankly, I'm glad that he was killed while he was in prison because this man showed no mercy to all those victims. This man killed all those people, you know, had complete disregard for their bodies, committed all kinds of unspeakable acts. This man deserved to die. And I think that there are certain situations that may warrant the death penalty. So this is a situation that I struggle with, but I think like in a case like this, where you have a monster that commits these kinds of crimes, I do believe that people like this deserve to die for their crimes. They don't deserve to have a life where they're subsidized by tax dollars for all those years. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Tell me what y'all think about this series, Dahmer. So with that, please rate, comment, subscribe, like the video, share the video, turn on that notification bell so that you'll know when I post new content on here.